So I've spent a couple of classes talking about the portrait of evil in The Lord of the Rings. And I did so for a good reason, because I think that the contemporary understanding of evil in its nature is so pernicious and so commonly, evil so commonly misunderstood even by Christians, that we find ourselves very quickly into unorthodox positions, if not outright heretical positions, and the culture certainly doesn't help us in this. And the mere fact that our contemporaries understand that there is evil in the world is not adequate to help us to deal with it as Christians. So we tend to be happy when any movie has a conflict between good and evil, and we'll just be satisfied with that fact, which is a pretty terrible compromise, because to suggest that there is good and evil, to me, it just seems to be obvious. But as I said to you, in the pantheistic understanding of the post-romantic era, we tend to see not black and white, but 50 shades of gray in terms of good and evil. And there is no black or white then. And the consequence of that is terrible. It's pernicious. But even some of the favored superheroes, like Batman and others, are marked by that. And what Tolkien does in The Lord of the Rings is present a very robust Christian view of good and evil. Even though there's no God, there are no angels, there are no priests, there's no churches, but there is a hard and fast portrait of good and evil in the Lord of the Rings that everyone recognizes and that constitutes its main appeal to its readers. And they aren't even aware of why they like it. They just know that they do like it, and that it speaks to them with a clarity, a moral clarity that they don't see anywhere else. And it surprises them. And the fact that that Tolkien is a Catholic and a Christian surprises them, because they don't see any references to that in his work per se. And so they almost love him for, as they would see it, not being a Christian in his representation of reality in his story. But I'm going to argue, and I do argue, that it's not because of his lack of commitment to his belief, but rather his commitment to a style of storytelling that's consistent with his premises, that he does it the way he does. But the account of good and evil is thoroughly Christian, and it is necessary to see it as such. So I've talked about evil already and said that Tolkien presents a view of evil consistent with the Augustinian tradition, which is that evil is not a thing or a power, it's the absence of good. It's privatio boni. And he consistently follows Augustine and Boethius in this portrait. But I haven't yet got to the thing that we most like about it, which is that he presents goodness in a particular way as well. And that is the most appealing thing. It has heroes whom we admire, and we cheer on, and we admire in particular their choices and their commitments and their resilience and their character. And that is the thing that's on display in The Lord of the Rings, and I think makes it so delightful. Now, this drawing in the background, as I'm going to freely confess, I can't draw. I've just copied it, and I've copied it from Peter Kreeft, his book on The Lord of the Rings, and I can't remember the title off the top of my head. Is it The Philosophy of Tolkien? Okay. So I've got it directly from that, and I think it's extremely helpful in a pictorial fashion, demonstrating what is at stake here. And it's very helpful insofar as it sketches out two positions of ethics, one that is almost ubiquitous in our day, which is the one down below, what I call moral relativism, or he calls moral relativism, which is a utilitarianism or a pragmatism You'll know it by those terms as well. And it infects the church, and it infects Christian universities, it affects pastors, it affects individuals, Christian individuals, and families in their decision-making processes. It is one of the blights of modernity, is that people who claim to be committed to God are in their own decisions so compromised that they're at odds with Christian truth. That's the position down below, number 2, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. Oh, I didn't complete the picture. That's bad. And let me do that, and it will come here, and it will be. And then it goes over here, and I think there's another component to it. Yeah, okay. So the deed happens. And then, does he have an arrow there? No, the arrow goes there. Okay. And then deed. And the justification, the ends justify the means, and so forth. And this here is Tolkien's perspective. It's a moral, absolutist perspective based on principles. It's a principalism, commitment to certain absolutes, moral absolutes. And you'll see that when he depicts the moral law, you can see the 10 commandments there in the background, the 10 words, the 10 logoi. And remember, in a couple of classes ago, I talked about the word logos and the different senses of the word, and there's a metaphysical one which underlies his use of logos. This is the one that Tolkien repeatedly puts before us and is the thing that governs the choices of the heroes of the Lord of the Rings. This one, not this one, never this one. In fact, it repudiates this one precisely by the way the characters act, and never act in moral, relativistic, or utilitarian, or pragmatic justifications for their actions. Never, ever, ever. Very clear. These are principled moral absolutists that he depicts before our eyes. And the reason why it's so appealing and striking is you will almost never meet anybody in this world right now who's alive who exhibits the same moral clarity or commitment to this. In fact, people like this are often characterized as being heartless and unfeeling and hard and difficult, because our age is marked by sensitivity and compassion and softness, and which are sorts of virtues. The portrait of the virtues that Lewis talks about in Mere Christianity, you remember last semester when he talks about the 7 virtues, are ones that we inherit from the pagan world. And they are hard virtues, virtues that we tend not to, when I say we, our contemporaries tend to devalue, if not despise. And what are these virtues? Courage, honor, chastity, obedience. These are virtues that our contemporaries mock, despise, and hate, because they seem inflexible, and the people that exhibit them are difficult to get along with because they are uncompromising, or they appear that way in their public expression. And our age is marked by types of virtues that are nonetheless virtues. So these sorts of virtues are pity and mercy and sensitivity and compassion, and to some degree humility. Whereas the virtues of old were certainly not humble, and certainly not marked by pity or mercy or even sensitivity. Can you imagine Achilles being described by any of the soft virtues? Never, ever in a million years. Nor Aeneas, for that matter. Nor any of Milton's portrait of it. Note that in Milton's Comus a Mask, it's about chastity, the virtue of chastity, and it's unswerving. It's an absolute commitment to the goodness of chastity in a way that modern readers find a little bit repellent, and yet attractive at the same time. There's something so committed to goodness there that Milton is not even going to qualify the virtue that he's praising. It's unqualified praise. We never see that in our culture, ever. But Tolkien portrays it in The Lord of the Rings. That's what I'm going to argue here. And to us, the people who are moral absolutists and principalists appear cruel and, as I say, unbending, unlikable. And we like moral relativists, people that understand from the other person's perspective and will show compassion and so forth. We're going to need both of them, and I've called them both, by the way, as principle. They are ethical, and they are actually virtues, even in the soft form. But which is the one that governs the other is the question. Because, of course, Christ is compassionate to those who are sinners, while he has no tolerance of the sin. He's unbending in his condemnation of sin, and yet he's compassionate for those who suffer from the consequences of the very thing that he despises. Right? So is Christ a moral relativist because he's compassionate, or is he a moral absolutist because he's unswerving in his commitment to destroy sin to the point where he's willing to actually take sin out by taking it upon himself? Is it an act of compassion, or is it a moral absolutism that drives him to it? I'm going to argue that it's the former. It's moral absolutism that drives him to show compassion. There is no other way. But in contemporary renderings of Christ's view of the cross, they emphasize the utilitarian, pragmatic, soft nature of Jesus' heart. It's always an appeal to the heart. And people that will insist on moral absolutism will say, oh, those are hard-hearted, intellectual, abstract, difficult people. That's how it's portrayed. And so we see Christ even through the lens of the moral relativist, which is all around us because we're surrounded by pragmatists and utilitarians. By the way, Jeremy Bentham, who's the father of modern utilitarianism, created a calculus of pain and pleasure, by which he suggested that public policy should be driven, and it's the greatest possible good is the outcome of that for the greatest number of people. He quantifies ethics. An ethical act will benefit the most people, and that drives public policies, it drives church decisions, it drives family decisions. What's going to be the outcome for me? So we begin with the principles and values that we hold, and you will find that in Christian universities and in companies that are trying to make a profit, they'll begin with a statement of their values. And then they'll have a mission statement that derives out of it. They create their own principles. And what are our values? But what drives this, unfortunately, is not the values and principles which they assert there, because these are actually questionable. The values that they come up with. They seem right in their own eyes, and they may be right in some ways, but they're not absolutes. And the only absolutes that are clear to them are the consequences. So they do it for the sake of the consequences that they believe will result from their values and principles, which are then questionable. And the justification for it is driven by the consequences, so the greatest possible good for the greatest number of people. We'll get more fruit this way. We'll maximize our profits. We'll do more for the kingdom of God. So they say. I've been in these conversations as long as I've been a Christian, in Christian institutions, and I think people are shocked at how obtuse I am about consequences. And my argument back to them is the consequentialists have bad consequences, and they don't seem to recognize that being committed to principles given a priori as unswerving, unbending, unchanging, you actually have better consequences than consequentialism. But we'll get to that in a minute. Illustration of this, and this is again from Kreeft, and it's a good illustration, but you would get this in any philosopher's discussion of ethics. These, what do they call them? What do they call them these cases? What do they call the situation? Oh, thought experiments. But it's a problem. So you've got 10 men in a lifeboat. They're all starving. If they kill one man and eat him, 9 will live. If they don't, they're all going to die. You would get these, right? So what's the ethically right choice? If you're a consequentialist, if you're a moral relativist, then you're going to say, well, you eat one of them, because at least 9 of them are going to survive that. Isn't that a good outcome? Whereas the moral absolutist will say, we will not eat that. We will not eat even one of them. Both Lewis and Tolkien are moral absolutists. That's why people like both Lewis and Tolkien. They're moral absolutists. And they will argue that the individual ought not to be sacrificed for the group. So that's a direct contradiction of utilitarian pragmatist thinking. Another illustration, but it's the end justifies the means. Other examples would be waging a preventative war, assassinating a dictator, or burning a little incense to Caesar, calling Caesar a god so that your family doesn't get killed. Just a little pinch of incense and say, Caesar is Lord. Yes, I believe Jesus is Lord, and I'm going to say that Caesar is Lord because it will spare my family from the consequences of not doing this. And I'll still believe that Jesus is Lord in my heart, although I've effectively, publicly contradicted that by also admitting that there's another God, and I've thereby defied the very first commandment that you'll have no other gods besides me, right? So it's the direct repudiation of that. So you can see that ethical decisions have serious consequences. And so the question then is, does the end, both in the sense of consequence and motive, justify the means in these cases? Or are there absolute principles that need to be obeyed no matter what the consequences are? So this is utilitarianism, and this is, as it were, principlism. Okay, and the difference is determined by what justifies a moral choice. Is it obedience to principles, and therefore a priori, or is it and before the action itself, a commitment to something before we even consider the action? Are we committed to the a priori principle above all things? It will determine everything that happens after that. Or is it your estimation of the good and evil consequences of the act that comes after it? You think about the outcome. And again, in these businesses and in universities and in churches, they'll think, oh, hold on a second here. Let's just think about the consequences before. Let's look before we leap and think about what will happen if we do that. And we know what will happen. We will be vilified. We'll be attacked. We'll have people leave. Our financial viability will be at risk. Are we really going to do that? And this diagram displays it. Now, The Lord of the Rings gives 4 arguments for this position. 4 types of arguments. And they are against utilitarianism, because it's either or. You're either an absolutist and a principalist, or you're a utilitarian or a pragmatist. And Tolkien is very clear about this. Now, the first is what Kreeft calls epistemological in its character. I think he's correct. And that's simply the fact that we don't know the future, which seems to me an incontrovertible fact. We don't know the future. We're not God. So Elrond's last words to the fellowship, which his council had chosen and these last words as they exit Rivendell to try and save the world of Middle-earth from Sauron's designs to bring it all under his power, are these words. You do not yet know the strength of your hearts, and you cannot foresee what each may meet upon the road. Look not too far ahead. Now that commitment to doing the right thing, irrespective of the cost or the consequence, is what Elrond encourages them to consider throughout. And again, it's clear biblical teaching. Don't worry about tomorrow. Deal with the task at hand today. Do what is right in the time that you have control over, which is the present. And be determined by what has happened in the past, which is why you cite the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 10, 4 to 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. And this is what you teach your children, and what God did in the past. That's the nature of God, and it continues to be the nature of God, because the God of the Exodus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So that's unswerving. It's not going to change. So therefore, act in accordance with that. Be this, not that. So that's Elrond's counsel to the fellowship that he's called and commissioned. Go and act in accordance with that. Don't think about the consequences. Don't worry about that. Don't look too far ahead. Very clear and committed, hard to do in practice. But the things that you're going to confront will change, and you can't even see what's going to come. You don't know what's going to come across your path tomorrow. It's impossible for a person, a finite. Anybody who's not God and omniscient is going to not know what's going to confront them, and therefore should not be too worried about the future. Don't worry about tomorrow. So the marching orders, the principles don't change, but the situations we confront do change. They're unchanging, they're universal, they're not dependent on time or place. In other words, they're in God's time, which is eternal. We're acting in the eternal realm. So when we're called to pray in the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, we're asking for the eternal realm's marching orders to be our marching orders on earth, and thereby bringing about the eternal realm into the present finite realm. I think that's what we're called upon to do. By the way, the Lord's Prayer is a prayer that Jesus never himself prayed. It's the disciples' prayer that the Lord gives. It's not called the Lord's Prayer because Jesus prays the prayer, because he asked for us to forgive us our sins. Jesus didn't commit any sins. It's for you to pray this. So when you pray, you say, there you go. So the principles that are unchanging and universal are not dependent on time and place, and they are what we do know. We do know God's character, and God's character is expressed in his 10 words, his laws. That has not changed. It's the moral law based on the 10 commandments, the revelations of God's character. It's unchanging. We do know that. We don't know what other things, but we will act in accordance with what we do know and not be swayed by what we don't know, which is our perceived calculation of the a posteriori consequences that we can foresee ahead of us. Hey, you know what? It seems by my sight that if we do the right thing, that our business is going to shut down and people are going to vilify us. But hold on, what if everybody is so sick of moral compromise and relativism that they're desperate for moral courage to be displayed and will swing to your banner and follow you and want to do what you do? And they're just waiting for somebody to stick their head above the parapet. How about that? Is that possible? Well, you won't know until you step out in faith. But the faith is in the thing that you do know and can know, the only thing you can know. Anyway, the summary of this is in Aragorn's reply to a question by Eomer, and cited here. This is Aragorn. It is hard to be sure of anything among so many marvels. The world is all grown strange. Elf and dwarf in company walk in our daily fields, and folk speak with the Lady of the Wood, and yet live. And the sword comes back to war that was broken in the long ages ere the fathers of our fathers rode into the mark. How shall a man judge what to do in such times? Asks Eomer. Aragorn's answer, as he ever has judged, said Aragorn. Good and ill have not changed since yesteryear, nor are they one thing among elves and dwarves and another thing among men. It is a man's part to discern them as much as the golden wood as in his own house. Good and evil have not changed. Again, Aragorn affirms this position. And there's not a different ethics for different people or different groups. There's only one law. It's what Lewis calls the Tao. And these are principles, and we know them as such. Not infallibly, we must discern them, and sometimes it's a very hard thing to do. But Aragorn says we have to discern them. So in the passage where Frodo is believed to have been killed, Sam is left with a very hard choice, and the title of the chapter is called "The Choices of Master Samwise," I believe. He can't discern whether to take the ring or to stay with his master. There's his choice. That's a hard choice because he thinks Frodo's dead. So the obvious thing to do will be to take the ring and to leave him. That's a hard choice, and I don't know what the right choice in that situation is. I mean, the fellowship has been sworn of their own free will, and they can abandon it at any time if they choose, to go and try and destroy the ring. And Sam was there to support Frodo in this, and Frodo is now dead. What does he do? Because he's loyal to his master, but his master's dead, and if he sticks with him, then the ring will not be destroyed. But if he leaves his master, then he's abandoned his fidelity to him in some ways. He's dishonoring him. Same choice, by the way, is there for Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli when Merry and Pippin are taken. Do they go after them to try and save them, or do they stick with Frodo and Sam? And they decide, and Aragorn says, boy, this is a difficult choice, and I need really to discern what's right here. And it's a difficult choice for him, and he decides we're going to follow Merry and Pippin. But if you're following that choice there, you're thinking, I don't know what, there's no clear decision to be made here. Both seem right, and both seem wrong, because there's a terrible consequence to it. Decides to follow and leave Frodo and Sam to their own vocation and calling, and trust that they will manage to do it. And again, Aragorn then is following the advice given to Elrond that not to look too far ahead. It's not actually on the fellowship that this endeavor should succeed or not. And that's because our reasoning is not always right, and sometimes must be overridden by a deeper knowledge. Like Sam's inner monologue on Mount Doom. And this is his voice thinking about the choices in front of him here. And the voice is one that's questioning himself. It's what Lewis calls the voluble self, the one that starts questioning whether we're doing the right thing. You have doubts and hesitations. And Sam to himself says, you're a fool. You're the fool going on hoping and toiling. You could have lain down and gone to sleep together 2 days ago if you hadn't been so dogged. But you'll die just the same, or worse. You might just as well lie down now and give it up. You'll never get to the top anyway. This is after he's taken the ring. And then a deeper wisdom comes as a counter voice within himself. I'll get there. If I leave everything but my bones behind, said Sam, and I'll carry Mr. Frodo up myself if it breaks my back and heart. So stop arguing. Who's he speaking to? Himself. So stop arguing. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to take both. So there's the decision. I'm going to get the ring, and I'll carry Frodo. He didn't have to make a compromise. That's what he decides he's going to do. Now, as it turns out, to his surprise, Frodo's not dead, but he didn't know that. He was willing to take on both tasks there. Now, how you're going to carry Frodo to that end, who knows? But he's committed to both. He doesn't make the choice. And in the end, the choice is taken from him by what turns out to be the situation at hand. But note that Sam's deeper wisdom treats his rationalizing voice as an other voice within himself, not his true self. I'm not going to listen to that voice. That's a voice of counsel that seems reasonable, but I'm not going to listen to it. It's not, he doesn't say it's himself, it's another voice. It's a bit like Gollum and Smeagol. The voice of doubt. And that's because what passes for reasoning is often just rationalizing, and rationalize in accordance with what the consequences are. Sam dismisses that. I'm not going to listen to that voice of consequentialism or utilitarianism. And what we see here, and this is this is an important point. Moral absolutism is not, as its detractors say, arrogant. It's the exact opposite. It's humble. The principles are absolute. The duty to those principles must be absolute. But it's not our knowledge of those principles that's absolute. The principles are, our knowledge of them is not. So again, some people say that I trust in my faith, and that's actually a misrepresentation of the Christian faith. We don't have faith in faith, we have faith in Christ. We don't have faith in our faith. That would be an extremely arrogant position. We have faith in our principles and values. I don't have faith in my principles and values. Those are dependent on things that I would create. That would be depending on myself. That would be arrogant. We depend on revelation. God's revelation of himself in the person of his son, Jesus. That's who I have trust in and faith in. And I will humbly obey what he says. And Lewis and Tolkien both strongly emphasize the importance of obedience to an absolute. While the characters aren't absolutists, they believe in an absolute, and the absolute is none other than God. So there's an absolute status for the principles, not for our knowledge of them, and it is moral relativism, on the contrary, that's arrogant, because it will not bow to principles, and because it plays God in assuming that we can know the future also. Note that is also incumbent upon this. So when companies and persons and churches and universities create statements of values and mission statements, and they're effectively playing God, and they think that they can foresee the future based on market research. I've been asked for this when I have proposed Christian schools to churches. They want me to construct a business plan with market research, hopefully justifying it, and spreadsheets and anticipated numbers and so forth. Part of me understands it, but part of me thinks you just don't get it. You just don't get what a Christian education will be and what it's based upon. And it's not going to be the results. The results will come, actually. But if I'm after the results, then I'm already chasing my tail on this. So it's assuming then that we can know the future, and to some degree do know the future. And it's again because of the perceived consequences, which then will justify the deeds that we then commit. So we're not looking at the principles, we're looking at the outcomes. The outcomes are driving everything. So the tail's wagging the dog at all times. And at the same time, this is pure arrogance. We take the place of God. So that's the first form. It's an epistemological form of argument that he makes. Second is an anthropological argument. Exactly the reverse of what the relativist claims is at stake here as well. The relativist, which is the utilitarian or the pragmatist, which has been taught in the Western world from the 19th century onward. It's the philosophy of John Dewey as well, which is taught in every school as basically the word of the Lord. I could go on at great length about that, but they claim that their philosophy is personal and warm and committed to others. It's compassionate. It's inclusive. It embraces the diversity of people. It thinks about people's feelings and meets them where they are. Because as they say, principles are for people. People aren't there for principles. We don't do things for the sake of principles. We do them for people. So think about the people that you're speaking to here. But as we see in The Lord of the Rings, the relativist flexibility and compassion and compromise, just like Gandalf himself, who's marked by pity, that's his chief virtue, is regularly displayed as something that will ultimately harm people. If I show pity, I will actually do the exact thing, or I will refuse to do the thing that must be done, which is to destroy the ring and not to use it. Pity will not be compassionate. It will be ultimately destructive, including self-destructive. And yet, Tolkien is going to laud pity, the pity that stayed Bilbo's hand, right? He's going to talk about that. I'll get to that next time. But so the real personalism that Tolkien wants to promote to us is principalism. Because the utilitarian will sacrifice people if necessary. Just like in the lifeboat where there's no food. We'll eat one guy and 9 will live out of it. And the utilitarian is just like Saruman in the end. So Saruman's a utilitarian. And they rank quantity over quality. The number of people over the quality of the individual persons who all bear the image of God. And an individual is of inestimable worth. There is no greater value that a person has than his soul. So sacrificing a soul for the sake of everybody's souls mistakes the nature of the very thing that's being sacrificed. You can't quantify a soul. But the utilitarian ranks quantity over distinctions of quality. Back in first year, I had you read A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, and that's exactly the calculus that was going on. If we do this and start eating the babies, then we'll solve the problem of poverty. We'll have a healthier national diet. We'll make couples stay together. We'll encourage marriage. We'll discourage abortions, et cetera, et cetera. He makes all sorts of calculations, but they're calculations based on numbers, and he will quantify it. And that's a utilitarian argument. And they will argue effectively that 9 live cannibals are better than 10 dead heroes. Right? That's the argument. And it is true that principles are for people and not the other way around. And that's why they are absolute, by the way. Because the people for whom the principles are there are individuals. By the way, in the group culture Marxist group identity politics of our day that pits the women's group or the gay group or the women's rights, all these rights, the one minority that is never defended is the individual. The ultimate minority is the individual, and the individual has no value in the group identity politics calculation, utilitarian calculation of our contemporaries. No rights. no consideration. So the ultimate minority, the individual, is crushed by the pragmatism of the group identity politics. But it's because principles are for persons that Tolkien defends moral absolutism. And so he will particularly laud and depict principles like loyalty and friendship. Boy, what a value does he place on loyalty and friendship. That's why Aragorn chooses to go and save Merry and Pippin, out of loyalty to them and friendship towards them, because it's for persons, and these persons are going to be sacrificed if we abandon them. And we don't know what will happen if we leave Sam and Frodo. We don't know, but we do know if we leave them that we will lose our dear friends. We know that, so we have to stop that. We don't know this, but we do know that, so we will go that way. It seems an odd decision for the leader of the free West to go after his friends that are certainly going to die. So what that depicts is that Aragorn is not a legalist without feelings. He's an absolutist on the moral worth of the individual. And so duty is to persons, not to principles. And so Frodo at the Black Gate says this: I am commanded to go to the land of Mordor, and therefore I shall go. If there is only one way, then I must take it. What comes after must come. Why? He's been commanded. And if there's only one way, then he's going to listen to Gollum and go up the stair. If that's the only way, then that's the way I'm going to have to go. Cirith Ungol, that's the way. I have no choice. I have to obey. And what he's not recognizing there is that Gollum's deceiving him. There is other ways, and he's trying to deceive him and betray him, but he doesn't know that. But what comes after must come. Note that in that last sentence, Tolkien is deliberately rejecting utilitarianism with its calculation of consequences. So if I die, then I guess I'm going to die. But I've been sworn to do this, and I'm going to obey. And note that Frodo has been commanded by a person. So about the personalism of the moral absolutist, he has been commanded by Elrond and also Gandalf to take the ring. Ring bearer, you will now do this. We're charging you with it. You've done it freely, but we are now commanding you what you've chosen. You will do this. And he obeys those persons that he's sworn to obey in this. He's not thinking of his own principles and values. He's not thinking about the consequences. He's thinking that he made an oath, just like Sam made an oath. I made a promise, Mr. Frodo, a promise. And so he's going to jump into the water and drown. Another illustration of the value of moral absolutes there that Sam evinces in his actions. He jumps into the water, can't swim, going to drown. Yes, but I promised that I would follow you to the end, and so I'm going to do that. I promised who? Frodo. Seems really odd to our ears, but that's exactly what's driving the decisions there. Note that he doesn't speak like a Kantian. I'm obeying reason and the dictates of reason, this detached, impersonal force. He's not obeying duty any more than Christians are obeying faith. Either they're obeying a person. They're not obeying the categorical imperative that will be apply in every situation, irrespective of this, of right or wrong even, and consequences. He doesn't commit to a rational duty and obey it. Ultimately, he obeys the persons that he swore to obey. So you first will know and trust and love a person, and then you will obey. And that's what he displays. Third argument is a psychological one. So there was an epistemological one. There was an anthropological one, and now there's a psychological one, and it's very simple. Bad people are often utilitarians. Utilitarianism tempts you to to be bad. Even if you don't want to be, even if you're a good person, even if you have strong values, you're tempted towards badness. So Saruman's argument to Gandalf for joining the apparently inevitable winner, Sauron, before it's too late is exactly that. You know that no one can resist the power that's risen in Mordor. It would be wise, Gandalf, if we joined him. It would be wise, says Saruman. And it is wise. You know who's going to win. You want to be on the winning side, not on the losing side, don't you? So we're going to do that. Now, he's made a calculation of the consequences, which he sees as inevitable. And as a consequence of his consequentialism, his lack of principle, his moral relativism, his dismissing of this in terms of his personal values and the outcomes that he perceives, Saruman becomes evil. Remember, Saruman is a good character. In fact, he is Gandalf's commander, as it were. And he loses his rank because he's a moral relativist and becomes evil. Good people are not utilitarians. Why? Because they exercise the great non-utilitarian moral virtues of charity, self-forgetfulness, and self-sacrifice. They don't think of themselves in the calculation. Whereas Saruman is certainly thinking about the personal consequences of being on the right side. Here's a quote. Gandalf chose to come to himself, and he was the first to be lost, answered Gimli. His foresight failed him. This is after Gandalf had fallen in, remember, he's on the bridge in Khazad-dûm, and he falls into the abyss. And Gimli's verdict on this was that his foresight failed him. Gandalf, for all of his wisdom, didn't foresee this outcome. It was a bad outcome. So he's look at the consequence of this action. And there's a rebuke here in Aragorn's response, which is this: the counsel of Gandalf was not founded on foreknowledge for safety for himself or for others, said Aragorn. It was not on the basis of safety. The whole debacle of COVID was done under the auspices of safety. It's a utilitarian justification for depriving people of their rights and freedoms. It's an impersonal justification. It's a consequentialist argument that allegedly has in view people, but it sacrifices people and it doesn't care about the consequences per se. And Gandalf's counsel is right at the heart of Tolkien's ethics: short, sweet, hard, and true. To cast aside regret and fear, to do the deed at hand. That's the advice of Gandalf. Grit your teeth, do what's right, and leave the consequences to God, basically. Or you want to put it in more biblical language: seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all other things will follow it. There you go. Seek it first, and his righteousness, and all other things will follow it. So it's this, and then the consequences will follow. But if you pursue the consequences, you forfeited the kingdom right there. Okay, so that's the third. The fourth is a historical argument in its character. It's the argument not from principles, but from consequences, actually. And it's what I said earlier. The consequentialist argument, it's a form of consequentialist argument against consequentialism, which is that the consequences of consequentialism are bad. If I pursue this, I almost always end up in a bad situation. If I do things for the outcome that I perceive, I'll get a bad outcome. If I'm unprincipled, I will be corrupted in the process, and all of my plans for a good outcome will come to ruin. Whereas the consequences of principlism are demonstrated in the Lord of the Rings to be good. The company succeeds, even in its failure. Remember, Frodo does not succeed in destroying the ring, but the ring is destroyed. And it's the commitment to the principles, absolutely, of the company that allows them to get and do the one thing that needs to be done at the cost of apparently all, and yet they're rewarded for it. They haven't destroyed evil. We've already talked about that. It perdures beyond the destruction of the ring. It will come back in a more insidious spiritual form. And yet there is a victory that is engaged there. And the reason is that consequentialism is willing to give up far too easily. So Frodo, when he sees the whole army of Mordor gathered at the Black Gate, at first thinks, I'm too late. All is lost. I tarried on the way. Even if my errand is performed, no one will ever know. There will be no one I can tell. It will be in vain. Remember, this is the voice inside of his head. It's not the voice of commitment. It's the voice of despair. It's the same voice that was in Sam's head. You fool, what have you done? And then it almost comes like it's not him speaking, but it's a voice that comes into his head, and then he decides to carry on. Same thing here. He sees the armies of Sauron have gathered at the Black Gate, and they're going to march out, and they're going to destroy Aragorn and his army, because the numbers are, this is not a fair fight. So he may destroy the ring, but there's going to be nobody left to benefit from it. Yeah, even if I manage to get there now, everybody's going to be wiped out. So what a terrible situation. But then, shortly after, same passage, despair had not left him, but the weakness had passed. He even smiled grimly, feeling now as clearly as a moment before he had felt the opposite, that what he had to do, he had to do, if he could, and that whether Faramir or Aragorn or Elrond or Galadriel or Gandalf or anyone else ever knew about it was beside the purpose. Doesn't matter if anybody ever knows, and if they all have perished because of this, it doesn't matter, because it's right. Then I will continue on. Like you could not get a starker anti-consequentialist position than Frodo's. And the consequences of Frodo's unwillingness to bow to consequentialism creates a much greater consequence than he could ever have done if he had gone down the path of listening to the rationalizing voice in his head. Now, we've already looked at Lewis on this, and Lewis says the same thing. This is why I've dealt with both men on this course, sci-fi and subcreation. He is a staunch moral absolutist, and he attacks utilitarianism all over the place. So in Mere Christianity and in The Abolition of Man, he's arguing against moral relativism and consequentialism and pragmatism. You know, the good of humanity will not happen. It will come at the expense of our humanity. And we're doing things for man, and actually you won't be doing it for man, you'll be doing it for some men. And the some men who are doing it on their own self-interested behalf will sacrifice their own humanity to achieve power in the end, and there'll be nothing left because we've abolished man. We've abolished man by doing what? By abolishing moral absolutism. That's what the third chapter of The Abolition of Man is about. We will sacrifice the very thing that we're trying to save and preserve. And you would have seen, remember in The Magician's Nephew, that was Diggory's choice. To obey Aslan and not accept a magic apple from the witch, even though it would have healed his dying mother. And Aslan tells him when he's made his choice, if you had done otherwise, Aslan said, it would have healed her. That magic apple, if you had taken it, it would have healed her. But not to your joy or hers. The day would have come when both you and she would have looked back and said it would have been better to die in that illness. That is what would have happened, child, with a stolen apple. It is not what will happen now. What I will give you now will bring joy. It will not in your world give endless life, but it will heal. Go, pluck her an apple from the tree. Remember that? Same sort of moral teaching. It's a commitment to this same sort of principlism. And so consequentialism has had bad consequences, and obedience to duty rather than consequences has good ones. Both of them show that. If you want another good work by Lewis on this, read First and Second Things. It's a great essay. In God in the Dock, first and second things. Putting first things first. Rather than the consequences of the second things. Very important in your own lives. Clearly demonstrated in Tolkien's work. And in this, then, those four arguments for moral, ethical absolutism, we have heroes that demonstrate that for us. Why so? Because they represent courage. And we need representatives of courage. It's not a philosophical dialogue that we have here. It's a story. Stories have heroes. Heroes exhibit the thing that is needed to defeat evil. And the chief thing that they need is courage. A hero is a courageous person. And I'm going to read directly from Peter Kreeft here. In a fallen world, courage is among the most important of virtues. Chesterton, musing on Gethsemane and Calvary, notes that Christianity is, quote, the only religion which adds courage to the virtues of the Creator. Tolkien says, quote, the good of the world depends on the behavior of an individual in circumstances which will demand of him suffering and endurance far beyond the normal, demand a strength of body and mind which he does not possess. Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century English moralist, writer of a dictionary, Dr. Johnson, great storyteller, points out that where courage is not, no other virtue can survive except by accident. That's quoted by C.S. Lewis in Surprised by Joy. Where courage is not, no other virtue can survive except by accident. So in the Screwtape Letter, then, Lewis says, courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. Are you going to be courageous? All the other virtues, the wisdom, your compassion, your pity, are going to be tested by your courage when it gets hot and hard. Now, really, this is really interesting. Lewis points out that even Jesus was not a man of great natural courage. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he asked for the cup to be taken from him. But then says, but not my will, but thy will be done. And the supernatural courage that comes to him from God delivers the man Jesus. So it's not that he had supreme individual human courage. It's that God's supernatural courage comes to him at the point of his utmost human weakness, when he's sweating blood. Remember? He's sweating blood. Doesn't want to go there. And then he does there. God gives him the courage to do what he himself as a man lacked. So the God-man Jesus. Fascinating, the accounts there. So Frodo's a bit like Jesus in that sense. He has a divine aid in the end. He fails as a man. Not that he's a man. He fails as a hobbit in destroying the ring. He will not do what he came to do. The ring is mine, whatever. Okay. But in that sense. So he is a courageous character, and courage gives characters hope as well. And hope is something that the company also possesses to a great degree. And in fact, the three theological virtues, which I'm going to talk about next time, faith, hope, love, and the greatest of these is love, are Tolkien's particularly Christian touches to the Lord of the Rings. When people appeal to faith, they appeal to it in two senses of the word. One of them is wrong and the other is correct. One kind lives on the surface of yourself, in your feelings, in your mind. I have faith in something. It's part of myself. That's the one that needs to be killed in some ways. I have faith in myself. I have faith in this. It's a very faltering thing. It's there today, gone. It wavers and so forth. A deeper form of faith underlies that, and it comes out in a way through suffering, because suffering produces hope and character. And it's the forge of, or the crucible of suffering that creates the hope that comes through faith. Remember, in Hebrews 12, it recounts those who lived by faith, and the faith gave them hope to live for the city whose architect and builder is God, that they never saw. And why? Because they were animated by the love of God. God's love drove them to have faith in him and to have hope in the future. And so the three work together. And so when the fellowship has to do without this superficial hope, because it seems like the situation's hopeless, and they carry on, like when Gandalf dies in Moria, we think he's dead. I mean, until you've read the book, you have no idea. I think Gandalf's gone. It was crushing to me when I read it. I was glad I hadn't seen the films. I had no idea that Gandalf was going to die. It was like, this is terrible. How can you kill Gandalf? Like, this is the best character. I had all my hopes in Gandalf. Like, Gandalf's going to lead them through this. He's the wise old guy. You want him to go, and now he dies. It's terrible. And so when Gandalf falls into Moria and Frodo and Sam crawl towards Mordor, that seems like it's a hopeless task. But they continue to carry on and to act and give every ounce of themselves, because there's a hope that drives them despite their apparently desperate circumstances. And that is the sort of hope, again, that contradicts the utilitarian pragmatic consequentialism which drives most of us, because of a lack of principlism on our part. And that hope that's deep within them is harder to define, because it doesn't seem to have any external reason. Why would they be hopeful to carry on in this situation? It seems like if Gandalf has fallen, there's no hope here. And then Aragorn reluctantly takes on, well, I'll lead you then. And he seems to be not very sure of himself. So nearly every time Tolkien uses the word hope, he means a surface hope. And when the surface hope disappears, the deeper hope takes over. So hope is not based on what we see, but what we don't see. And that's, again, the trajectory of the novel is to be driven by the unseen. But the unseen is the presence of the Logos in the midst of us, to which we are unswervingly. It's an a priori principle that drives us at all times. And it tests us. Do we have hope in him and what he says, or in the consequences of who he is? And if it's the consequences, then we're going to be kicked away. And of course, everybody's driven by consequences. But you have to say, the consequences, and God's effectively testing you there. Do you love me more than these? Man is not born for bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from the mouth of God. Right? That's Jesus' teaching right there. It's not by this, but that. You'll get enough bread. Why are you asking me about the bread? So after Gandalf dies in Moria, Aragorn in command says, "Farewell, Gandalf. Did I not say to you, if you pass the doors of Moria, beware. Alas, that I spoke true. What hope have we without you?" He turned to the company. "We must do without hope," he said. And then they carry on. There's something like a hope that's carrying them onwards. But even Aragorn thinks that the situation's hopeless. And yet they're going to go on anyway. Now, what prompts him to carry on in this situation where all of their hopes appear to have fallen with Gandalf in? And it's exactly that. It's a deep spiritual hope in something they can't see. And similarly, there is something invisible that underlies the whole journey of the fellowship that seems to be driving them on. So there is no reference to God, as I said, in The Lord of the Rings, and yet God seems to be present, driving them in hopeless situations. So it's a deeper hope than something that they visibly can hope for. And when they approach the Black Gate, it seems hopeless to sneak past thousands of orc, but we hear that Frodo's face was grim and set, but resolute. He was filthy, haggard, and pinched with weariness, but he cowered no longer, and his eyes were clear. "I purpose to enter Mordor, and I know no other way. Therefore, I shall go this way. I do not ask anyone to go with me." Sam said nothing. The look on Frodo's face was enough for him. He knew that words of his were useless, and after all, he had never had any real hope in the affair from the beginning. But being a cheerful hobbit, he had not needed hope as long as despair could be postponed. Now they were come to the bitter end, but he had stuck to his master all the way. That was what he had chiefly come for, and he would still stick to him. His master would not go to Mordor alone. Sam would go with him. Now, again, there's a resolution there and a admirable commitment to a person in his master, which shines in an age of people abandoning their friends, leaving their spouses, betraying almost everything for the sake of some sort of utility that they see in front of us. This shines forth. And as the despair, and it's almost total, settles upon the fellowship outside the Black Gate, and it seems the whole quest has failed, Frodo and the ring have been captured because Sauron's messenger comes out with the shirt and the sword and the cloak and the brooch and the mithril mail shirt. And it says, "A blackness came over their eyes, and it seemed to them in a moment of silence that the world stood still, but their hearts were dead and their last hope gone." And yet they don't yield. They have a hope that defies explanation. But when Tolkien uses the word hope, he means a superficial hope, because there's something that still drives them underneath all of that. Yet they would not yield, but fight to the end. And Pippin's last thought is, "So it ends as I guessed it would." His thought said, says Tolkien, even as it fluttered away, and it laughed a little within him ere it fled. Almost gay it seemed to be, casting off at last all doubt and care and fear. And now they're going to go fight. We're about to lose. Okay, so be it. Right? It's like the martyrs. When they go to their death, they go through, I might be wrong about this, but I believe that Cranmer ran to where he was going to be burned. As if he couldn't wait to get there in the end. It's going to happen. There's a crazy sort of joy that overcame him at that point. Might be wrong about it being Cranmer, but I thought it was. And so Frodo and Sam and all the characters lose hope, and yet they continue to act. And you can't act if you don't have some sort of hope that's driving you. And what's driving them is a commitment to their principles, but it's actually the principles, or rather the person who is behind the principles, that's driving them. So God is seen in the actions of the characters. And there is no other explanation. And so Frodo, right at the end of things, says to Sam, Lead me. As long as you've got any hope left, mine is gone. And here's Sam's response. So, that was the job I felt I had to do when I started, thought Sam. To help Mr. Frodo to the last step and then die with him? Well, if that is the job, then I must do it. But even as hope died in Sam, or seemed to die, it was turned into a new strength. Sam's plain hobbit face grew stern, almost grim, as the will hardened in him, and he felt through all his limbs a thrill, as if he was turning into some creature of stone and steel that neither despair nor weariness nor endless barren miles could subdue. With a new sense of responsibility, he brought his eyes back to the ground near at hand, studying the next move. It's not utility that is driving him here. There's something deeper than this. He's not hoping for a miracle. No reference to that. Like, oh, maybe God will intervene here. No such discussion. No comment on that. But a sort of hope in that was originally lodged in Gandalf that is self-denying. And that self-denial in the end is very important. It was Jesus in Gethsemane, and it ends up being Frodo's and Sam's and all the companies at the end when it looks like that death awaits them. There is no other possible outcome. It drives them to deny themselves and give themselves over to a person who is greater than they. And so hope, whose object in the last analysis is always a person, not an abstraction, reveals itself ultimately to be the person of God. Remember whose being is the I am, who acts. Remember I talked about in in Exodus 3, when God is asked who he is by Moses, he said, I am that I am, which is a very mysterious revelation. So he's the ground of all being. Okay, so philosophers can talk about that. But in Exodus 15, in the Song of Moses, Moses is praising God for being the Savior who acted. And so that word devar, the word for word in Hebrew, devar, which is both reference to word and also an action, we can see who God is by what he has done. And God acts through the fellowship. And so they believe in the same God that is evinced in Scripture, the person who acts. They have faith in him in the end. I'll talk about the three theological virtues next time. Do you have any questions, comments on this? I hope you think it was. I think it's helpful as to what constitutes the real delight in The Lord of the Rings. I'm convinced this is it. Its portrait of principled moral absolutism without compromise by a fellowship of individuals, and the good consequences that come from it, and the bad consequences that come from consequentialism of various sorts, of people that are betraying the fellowship. And they're not necessarily originally bad characters. Like Saruman is a great character, and Boromir even, although in the end Boromir repents and Aragorn says that he's won the greater victory. You think, what? He just betrayed the company. But he repents in the end. He dies repenting of what he did, and Aragorn says that he's won. It's a funny old incident there. How, in what sense has he won? In what sense has he not just betrayed them all and failed? Well, because he recognized that the greater battle was in allegiance to the one who called him. And he abandons himself in the end, which is good. Anyway, questions, comments? Okay, then I will finish for today. Next time I'll get to the three theological virtues and how they are presented there.